Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at natural theology. And, it's a pretty fascinating topic.
Yeah.
You've given me a lot of sources here, so we're going to try to go through, I guess, all of them to some extent and kind of suss out what this whole natural theology thing is all about.
Right. I mean, it's a pretty big topic. It's been around for a really long time, and it's been really influential. So it's worth taking a deep dive into.
Yeah. So I guess maybe before we even jump into it, just to kind of level set with everybody, maybe we can define what natural theology is. Because, sometimes when we're just talking out in the world with people who aren't necessarily philosophers, they might hear natural theology and kind of just think about, looking at nature and just be like, oh, that's so beautiful. It must be God.
Right.
But as we'll see, it's quite a bit more rigorous and detailed than that.
Yeah, I mean, so when we say natural theology, what we mean is the attempt to use our natural human cognitive faculties. So that's going to be reason, sense perception, introspection, those sorts of things, to investigate religious or theological matters. So, one thing to keep in mind is that it's not limited to an empirical inquiry into nature. So, I think that sort of like, look at the trees, you can see God sort of thing is maybe like a very, very simplified, perhaps misleading version of what natural theology really is.
Yeah. I mean, even that simplified version can be quite a bit more complex than that. Like, when we think about like the whole idea of intelligent design, which we'll touch on a little bit later, they're not saying, oh, look at the trees. They're saying, look at the complexity of the human eye.
Right.
How could this possibly have evolved through natural selection?
Right. So that's actually, a more sophisticated argument from design. And that's, historically been one of the most common types of natural theological arguments. But so it's not limited to that. But it also crucially doesn't appeal to special non-natural faculties or supernatural sources of information. So, miracles, divine revelation, scripture, those sorts of things.
Yeah. And I guess maybe it would be helpful to say, what we're talking about when we say it doesn't involve supernatural, we're talking about like revealed theology.
Yeah, exactly.
Where revealed theology is going to be much more based on things like scripture and divine revelation and I guess like direct interaction or communication from God, I suppose.
Right. I mean, so you could think of the difference between natural theology and revealed theology in terms of the sources of information that you're using.
Right.
So natural theology is just going to use the same sources of information that we use in, pretty much any other inquiry, whether it be, scientific or philosophical, whereas revealed theology is going to use these, special kind of privileged sources of information that are, perhaps available to only certain people.
And then also, I guess, natural theology, as we've kind of alluded to, has been around for a very long time.
Yeah.
It's not just like some recent thing that people have been talking about. I mean, we see this throughout history across many different cultures as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so you see engagement with natural theology in, Near Eastern thought, in African thought, Asian thought, European thought. So it's not just, one culture, one time period.
Yeah.
This has been a really perennial issue. And it's also been really divisive, actually. So, you've got... one of the sources that you sent me discusses natural theology in the context of Shiite versus Sunni Islam, and also in the context of Catholic versus Protestant Christianity. So, it's not just about like whether or not you think there are like good arguments for God's existence. It actually plays a role in, religious divisions that can have pretty serious consequences.
Yeah. And I guess, to kind of put this in context, like what are we as philosophers looking for when we're looking at, something like natural theology? Yeah. I mean, is it just simply like, does it prove God or not prove God? Or is there more to it than that?
Right. I mean, so as philosophers, I think, one of the things that we're most interested in is, the arguments themselves.
Right.
And, what's really interesting about the history of natural theology is that, it's almost like, like a philosophical laboratory where you've got, really smart people who are trying to figure out like, well, okay, like what are the limits of reason? Can we actually prove anything about God? And if so, like how do we do it? And what are the best arguments And, you've got, people critiquing these arguments and, new arguments being developed in response to those critiques. So, I mean, for a philosopher, it's just like a really rich, area to look at.
Yeah, and it's something where it's not just like happening in like a vacuum in some ivory tower somewhere.
Right.
I mean, this is something where, like, we alluded to intelligent design. Like, that's something which is very much alive in public discourse today. There are a lot of people, like, online. This is like one of the main things that people are arguing about is like, is there a God? And if so, can we prove it? And so I think it's something that, like, as philosophers, we can take these tools and then, also bring them out into the world.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is another one of those areas of philosophy where it's just, I think it's pretty clear that the history of philosophy can inform contemporary discussions.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are these peaks historically. The high medieval period was a really, really important time for natural theology, the early modern period as well. And we're sort of seeing, I think, something of a revival of natural theology in the public sphere today. So, as you mentioned, intelligent design, you've got people doing apologetics, you've got the new atheists, and, a lot of this stuff is happening, online. And I think a lot of the best work on natural theology is also coming out now. So the Gifford lectures, for example, that's a really prestigious lecture series that's been going on for over 100 years now, and a lot of the best philosophers of religion give those lectures, and so it's just like a really active area of contemporary philosophy.
Yeah. So I guess for our deep dive today, we're going to be looking specifically at the arguments for God's existence. You've kind of, I guess, told me that we're going to put aside the moral arguments for now because that could be a whole other thing.
Yeah, we could definitely do a whole deep dive just on moral arguments for God's existence.
Right.
So we're going to focus on the theoretical arguments. And there are two basic types of theoretical arguments. You've got the a priori arguments and the a posteriori arguments.
Okay. So to break those down, a priori meaning like coming from like pure reason, I suppose.
Yeah. So a priori arguments are going to be arguments that don't require any perceptual experience.
Yeah.
So you don't have to, go out and look at the world. You can just, sit in your armchair and think about concepts and, trying to figure things out that way.
Okay. And then a posteriori, like coming from after experience.
Yeah.
So meaning like looking at the world and then using that to form an argument.
Right. So these are going to be arguments that require empirical premises. So you're going to have some sort of observation of the world.
Yeah. Or,
some sort of scientific data or something like that.
Okay, cool. So why don't we jump into the a priori arguments?
Okay, great. So, probably the most famous type of a priori argument for God's existence is the ontological argument.
Right. And I think the first person that we usually go to when we're talking about the ontological argument is St. Anselm.
Yeah, St. Anselm of Canterbury. So he's writing in the 11th century.
And he's got this idea of, I guess it's like the definition of God, right?
Right.
Where he says that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, or that being than which none greater can be thought.
Right.
So what exactly does that mean?
So the way to understand this is, think about any being that you can possibly imagine.
Okay.
And then imagine a being that is even greater than that. And then imagine a being that's greater than that.
Mm-hmm.
And just keep going and going and going until you get to a being that's so great that you can't possibly imagine anything greater than it.
Right.
And that's God, according to Anselm.
And so then how does he use that to show that God actually exists in reality?
Right. So Anselm's argument is, it's a little bit complicated, but it's basically, it's a reductio ad absurdum. So it's an argument by contradiction.
Right.
And so the basic idea is that, let's assume for the sake of argument that God doesn't exist.
Okay.
Okay, so if God doesn't exist, then God only exists in the understanding.
Right.
So when we think about God, when we talk about God, that concept is only in our minds. It's not actually out there in the world.
Okay.
But Anselm says a being that exists in reality is greater than a being that only exists in the understanding.
Right.
So if God only exists in the understanding, then we can imagine a being that is just like God, but that also exists in reality.
Right.
And that being would be greater than God. But that's a contradiction because we already said that God is the greatest possible being.
Right. Than which nothing greater can be thought.
Exactly. So, our initial assumption that God doesn't exist must be false.
Right. So God must exist.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and one of the things that Anselm, I guess, does in his argument is he talks about like the fool
Yeah.
who says in his heart that there is no God.
Right.
And Anselm says that, well, even the fool, when they hear this phrase that than which nothing greater can be thought, they understand what it means.
Right. So, this idea that like even the atheist has to have some concept of God in their mind. It's a really interesting idea, and it's one that's been, really influential in the history of philosophy.
Yeah. So, I mean, Anselm's argument has been around for a very long time and it's been very influential. I mean, there are a lot of people who think that it's a really good argument for God's existence. But it's also been very controversial. I mean, there have been a lot of people who have objected to it.
Right. And I mean, some of the most brilliant philosophers in history have objected to Anselm's argument. So you've got people like Ganilo, who's a contemporary of Anselm.
Right.
And Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century. And then later on, you've got Immanuel Kant, who we'll talk about in a bit. But yeah, I mean, it's just, it's been a really hotly debated argument.
Yeah. So let's move on to René Descartes, who has his own version of the ontological argument.
Yeah.
So he was writing in the 17th century.
Right.
And he's got this idea that, I guess he's talking about clear and distinct perceptions.
Yeah. So Descartes argues that, anything that we clearly and distinctly perceive to be true must be true.
Okay.
And so he applies this to the idea of God. And he says that, when we think about God, we clearly and distinctly perceive that God is a perfect being.
Right.
And that perfection includes existence. So, just like we can clearly and distinctly perceive that, a triangle has three sides, we can clearly and distinctly perceive that God exists.
Okay. So the idea there is that, like, just like the three sides of a triangle are inherent to what a triangle is,
right,
existence is inherent to what God is.
Exactly. So existence is just part of God's essence.
Okay. But this also runs into a bunch of objections, right?
Yeah.
So I think one of the most common ones is Keteris.
Right, Keteris.
What brings up the idea of like a perfect island or a perfect lion or things like that.
Yeah. So Keteris's objection is that, if Descartes' argument works, then we could use the same argument to prove the existence of all sorts of things that we know don't exist.
Right.
So, for example, I could say, I have a clear and distinct perception of a perfect island.
Yeah.
And, perfection includes existence, therefore a perfect island exists.
Right. But we know that's not true. I mean, there's no perfect island out there.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, that's basically Keteris's objection. And, Descartes tries to respond to this, but I think, it's a pretty powerful objection.
Yeah. And we see a similar objection from Ganilo, who was responding to Anselm's argument as well.
Right. So Ganilo famously uses the example of a lost island. So he says, imagine that you've heard about this island.
Right.
And it's supposed to be the most perfect island. It's got, beautiful beaches, and it's got, perfect weather, and there's no crime, and there's no disease.
Paradise.
Yeah.
The perfect island.
Right, exactly. And so, you might think, well, if Anselm's right, then this island must exist because it's the greatest possible island.
Right.
But obviously, that doesn't follow. So, just because you can conceive of something doesn't mean that it exists.
Right. I mean, you could conceive of, like, a unicorn, but that doesn't mean that unicorns exist.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so that's one objection. But we also see another objection talking about this idea of predicating existence.
Yeah, so the idea here is that, when we say that something exists, exists isn't really a predicate in the same way that other properties are predicates. So,
right.
When I say that, the table is brown,
right,
I'm attributing the property of brownness to the table.
Right.
But when I say that the table exists, I'm not really attributing a property to the table.
Right.
I'm just saying that there is a table.
Yeah, like it's there. It's in reality.
Right. Exactly. And so, the objection to Descartes is that, he's basically trying to define God into existence.
Right.
He's saying, well, God is a perfect being and perfection includes existence, therefore God exists. But, the critic is going to say, well, that's not how existence works. You can't just define something into existence.
Okay. And then we also see, Mersenne.
Right.
Bringing up another objection.
Yeah. So Mersenne objects that, Descartes hasn't actually shown that the concept of a maximally perfect being is even possible.
Right.
So, it could be that the concept of God is just incoherent.
Right.
Like the concept of a square circle.
Yeah.
So, Mersenne is basically saying, well, you need to do more work to show that, this idea of maximally perfect being actually makes sense.
Right, before you can even start to say whether or not it exists.
Exactly.
Okay, and so how does Descartes respond to these various objections?
Yeah. So, Descartes has a whole series of pretty complicated responses, but, one of the things that he does is he appeals to this idea of what he calls true and immutable natures.
Okay.
So, the idea here is that there are certain ideas that, have a kind of like objective reality.
Right.
So, the idea of a triangle, for example, that's not just something that we made up. There's something about the nature of a triangle that makes it, have three sides and three angles.
Yeah, there's like some like truth like underlying it that makes it what it is.
Right. And so Descartes thinks that the same thing is true of the idea of God.
Okay.
He thinks that the idea of God is a true and immutable nature. And one of the properties of a true and immutable nature is that it exists.
Okay.
So, Descartes is basically saying, well, I can't really prove to you that the idea of God is a true and immutable nature, but, if you just think about it carefully,
right.
You'll see that it is.
So, is that really satisfying though? Like he's saying, well, I can't prove this, but just like think about it and you'll see that it's true.
Yeah. So, it's, a lot of people think that Descartes' response here is not very convincing.
Yeah.
Because it seems like he's just sort of like assuming what he's trying to prove. But, it's important to keep in mind that, Descartes is working within a very different philosophical framework than we are today.
Right.
So, he's not really concerned with like giving, like rigorous scientific proofs for things.
Right.
He's more concerned with like giving, like rational justifications for things.
Okay.
So, I think that, we can appreciate Descartes' argument, for its historical importance.
Yeah.
Even if we don't find it to be, completely convincing today.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's move on to Gottfried Leibniz.
Okay.
Who's another 17th century philosopher.
Right.
And he, I guess, engages with the ontological argument as well, building on Descartes, and also responding to the objections that have been raised.
Yeah, so Leibniz is a really interesting figure. He was a mathematician, he was a philosopher, he was a scientist, he was a diplomat,
right?
And he was also, very religious. And so he was really interested in trying to, reconcile faith and reason,
right?
And, he thought that the ontological argument was, a really promising way to do that.
Okay. So how does Leibniz's version of the ontological argument work?
Yeah. So Leibniz starts out by, sort of like granting some of the objections to Descartes.
Okay.
So he says, okay, like you're right. Like I can't just say that, existence is a perfection.
Right.
And then, conclude that God exists. But he thinks that there's still a way to make the argument work.
Okay.
And so what he does is he says that, the concept of God is the concept of a necessary being.
Okay.
So a necessary being is a being that has to exist.
Right.
It can't not exist.
Okay.
And so Leibniz says that, if God is a necessary being, then God's essence includes existence.
Okay.
So it's not that existence is just like a property that God has. It's that existence is part of what it means to be God.
Okay.
And so he thinks that this, this gets around the objections to Descartes.
Okay. So he's basically saying, like, we can't just say that existence is like a perfection on a list of perfections that God has.
Right.
But instead, existence is like inherent to the concept of God.
Exactly.
Okay. So then how does he actually like use that to argue that God exists?
Right. So Leibniz's argument is it's a little bit complicated, but here's like a simplified version of it.
Okay.
So he says, first of all, like we know that there are contingent beings.
Okay.
So a contingent being is a being that could have not existed.
Right.
So like you and I were contingent beings.
Right.
We could have not been born.
Right.
But Leibniz says that the existence of contingent beings requires a necessary being.
Okay.
Because, if there were only contingent beings, then it would be possible that nothing would exist. Because, each contingent being could have not existed.
Right.
So there has to be some being that exists necessarily in order to explain the existence of contingent beings.
Okay.
And that being is God.
Okay.
So that's one argument that Leibniz gives.
Right.
Another argument that he gives is that, perfections are simple and positive.
Okay.
So they don't have any internal contradictions.
Okay.
And so he says that, if you've got a bunch of perfections,
Right.
there's no reason why they couldn't all exist together in one being.
Okay.
So, the property of being all-knowing,
Right.
that doesn't contradict the property of being all-powerful.
Right.
And so Leibniz says that, since God is the being that has all the perfections,
Right.
then God must be possible.
Okay.
Because there's no reason why all those perfections couldn't exist together in one being.
Okay. And so then he's combining that with the idea that contingent beings require a necessary being.
Right.
And so then that means that God is that necessary being.
Right.
Okay. So that's, it's a lot more complicated than Descartes' argument, but I think it's a really interesting argument.
Yeah. I mean, I think, a lot of people think that Leibniz's version of the ontological argument is, one of the most sophisticated versions of the argument.
Yeah.
And it's one that's, still being debated today.
Okay. So I guess we can't really talk about the ontological argument without talking about Immanuel Kant.
Yeah.
Who I guess is most famous for his objection to the ontological argument.
Right. So Kant's critique of the ontological argument is, probably the most famous critique of the argument.
Yeah.
And it's one that's been, incredibly influential. So Kant's basic objection is that existence is not a predicate.
Right.
So, when we say that something exists, we're not really saying anything about what that thing is like.
Okay.
So, when I say that the table exists, I'm not saying anything about the table's color or its shape or its size.
Right.
I'm just saying that there's a table.
Yeah.
And so Kant thinks that the same thing is true of God.
Mm-hmm.
He says that, when we say that God exists, we're not really saying anything about what God is like.
Right.
We're just saying that there's a God.
Okay.
And so Kant thinks that the ontological argument is invalid because it's trying to derive the existence of God from the concept of God.
Right.
But Kant says that, you can't do that because existence is not a predicate.
Right. Okay. And so I think one of the ways that, contemporary philosophers of religion have kind of tried to get around this is by focusing on necessary existence.
Yeah.
So the idea is that, if we're talking about God, we're not just talking about any being.
Right.
We're talking about a being whose existence is necessary.
Right.
And so then if we can show that the concept of a necessary being is coherent,
right,
then we can, maybe get around Kant's objection.
Right. So, I mean, the idea here is that, if God is a necessary being, then God's essence includes existence.
Right.
So it's not just that God happens to exist.
Right.
It's that God has to exist.
Okay.
And so, the contemporary defender of the ontological argument might say, well, Kant's right that existence is not a predicate in the case of contingent beings.
Right.
But it is a predicate in the case of necessary beings.
Okay.
Because, for a necessary being, existence is part of what it means to be that being.
Okay.
So, that's one way to try to get around Kant's objection.
Okay. But, I mean, does that really work?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a really controversial issue.
Yeah.
There are some philosophers who think that, this response to Kant is successful.
Yeah.
But there are other philosophers who think that, Kant's objection is still fatal.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just, it's one of those things that philosophers are still debating. And, I don't think there's a clear consensus on the issue.
Okay. So I guess, we've talked about, these sort of classic versions of the ontological argument.
Right.
But then there's also this, more contemporary version
right,
that uses modal logic.
Yeah.